And hang on a second here. And we're good.
All right. So thanks for the intro. And so I work out of Olympia. Wouldn't be too far if you guys were in class for me to get over there and talk to you in person. And we do a lot of stuff with private landowners as far as like helping them identify problems they have and giving them management options. We also work with basically any non-federal land managers or landowners like state parks or state foresters like DNR and private industry. Um, and we also do monitoring. You know, Kirk mentioned the aerial survey. We do some annual trapping and like stream baiting for Phytophthora that causes sudden oak death, some long-term monitoring plots. And we report a lot of that monitoring information in an annual forest health highlights report, including results of our aerial survey. And that's available on the DNR Forest Health website. And so that's a nice place you can go to kind of see the major trends and what's going on, what we're working on each year. And if you are into using some of that data, like the aerial survey data products, that's available free online for you to use. So I went to grad school at Oregon State University, got my master's in forest science, and I specialized in researching predators for biological control of the hemlock woolly adelgid, which is a sucking insect that is really impacting eastern hemlocks and Carolina hemlocks in eastern North America. We have the adelgid out here in the Pacific Northwest, and so a couple of those predators have been exported and introduced back east in early days, but having some impacts, we hope, in controlling that invasive from Asia. So that's my background, and I'm going to go ahead and dive into it. I guess you guys are going to save questions for the end. Is that how this is going to work?
Yeah, let's do that.
Okay, sounds good. I'm going to share my screen, and I'm just going to turn my camera off and do this full screen. So I'm not going to like monitor the chat box or anything. So if anything comes up, I'm breaking up or something, just interrupt me.
Yeah, we'll do.
Okay. All right. So I'm going to, as requested, focus on the ecological roles, you know, the focus of this class, a little bit of management of forest insects and diseases, and really focusing on the general biology and the ecology of these things and how they work as disturbance agents in our forests. The actual identification and biology, there's just not enough time in an hour to cover those specifically because there's such a wide variety of things that we deal with across the state. And you get a lot of differing impacts between the wet west side and the drier east side. But I will cover kind of general management for those different major pest categories. Root diseases caused by fungi, the bark beetles, major tree killing insects, and defoliators like, you know, chewing caterpillars, sucking aphids, foliar diseases caused by fungi, and then hopefully with time, the dwarf mistletoes, which are parasitic plants that have a lot of impact in our forests. So I want to emphasize just at the start here that at low levels, even things we might consider to be pests, like bark beetles, can play a beneficial role. So when you got a tree like this that's freshly killed, the volatiles that it emits, like alpha pinene and ethanol, these insects are very attracted to that, and brings in a wide variety of these wood-boring insects, not just beetles, but all kinds of other tree infesting insects. So they are specialized in the early stages of the tree before decay sets in to penetrate that solid bark and get to the food source for their offspring. So in addition to these cartoon woodworking tools they've got here, they're also bringing with them fungi that are actually an important food source for their larvae. In addition to the wood, they're feeding on the fungi. that grows in the wood. So when they do that, they're also inadvertently introducing decay fungi, so kind of kickstarting that turnover of nutrient process. So really good guys in that sense. Some of them, like the bark beetles on the right, this Ips typographus here, are capable of killing trees. But even then, they're still providing an important ecosystem service by beginning that decay process, as long as the population isn't getting out of hand. And most of these, the longhorn wood borer and this metallic wood borer, they're really the native ones anyway don't kill trees, and so they're mostly beneficial to provide a lot of food source for other wildlife like birds. So if we're talking about friends in the forest, we don't want to forget about the other fungi that have nothing to do with wood borer activity. But most of these are playing a beneficial role, so like food for us as mushrooms and things, but mostly decaying dead organic matter. But just a few of them are parasitic and live on trees, like those that cause the cankers and stems, foliar diseases on the needles and leaves, and heart rots and root diseases. A dead tree, whether it's standing or down on the ground, provides a habitat for hundreds of wood and decay feeding or saproxylic insects. Many other insects that don't feed on the wood or the fungi use these dead trees as nesting sites. So, for example, carpenter ants, they're living in these trees. They don't feed on the wood. Wasps make nests in them, mason bees, and the list goes on. Termites. Perhaps the more obvious is the high number of vertebrates that rely on dead trees, like birds and things you heard about from Ken. And then, of course, we have our forest foes. The mountain pine beetle, you've probably heard of, has gotten a lot of press over the last 20 years for decimating vast areas, mostly lodgepole pine forests like British Columbia and the Rockies. We have the mountain pine beetle here in Washington, but in reality, the goofy monster movie painting aside, they're really surprisingly tiny for such a landscape level disturbance agent. It takes thousands of individual bark beetles to kill a tree. But for some of these insects, it's easy for them to achieve high numbers very quickly if you've got a lot of breeding material. So this map shows the cumulative footprint of that mountain pine beetle I was talking about, the damage done over 2.5 decades. So this is aerial survey data that I was talking about earlier, the red being the mountain pine beetle, mostly lodgepole again, a cumulative impact over those decades. It's in a lodgepole forest that's 100% host that they prefer, like during this outbreak, you get a sea of red, like this picture here, and these insects are able to maintain these outbreaks for a very long period of time, many years. Dendroctonus, so the genus name for this mountain pine beetle literally means tree killer. So when these lodgepole stands get to be around 80 years old, they become more susceptible. They're bigger, they're more decadent, they're more tightly spaced, so they're under stress. And the more host you have, the longer the outbreak is sustained. So those smaller trees, though, like after a fire, lodgepole seeds in, and you just get kind of this lawn of saplings of lodgepole. The bark beetles actually won't attack those because they're too small for now. They will grow up into it eventually. So those outbreaks are really part of the ecology, a long-term ecology of those lodgepole forests. There are lots of other major bark beetles in Washington, including mountain pine beetle. You can find them attacking all different species of conifers and some hardwoods. So some are more aggressive than others. The bark beetles that you might find in western hemlock or western red cedar, for example, don't typically reach those big outbreak populations like mountain pine beetle and kill healthy trees. They tend to be more opportunistic on weakened or stressed trees. And most of these beetles are species specific. So, for example, Douglas fir beetle shown here on the right, and that's the adults of Douglas fir beetle on the left there, only in Douglas fir primarily. And they also have a preferred diameter range that they attack. So like Douglas fir trees over 10-inch diameter are the preferred size for this Douglas fir beetle. Whereas in the branches and small diameter tops, you might get other species coming in. Okay, so the larvae of the bark beetles, you can see we're pointing to one here at the end of this gallery. They're the ones that are doing all the damage to the trees. They feed on the phloem, which is that sugar-rich inner bark layer. This tunnel, you guys can see my cursor on these, right?
Yes.
Okay. So this tunnel that's, in the case of Doug fir beetle, vertical here, is made by these adult beetles. And it's a female in this case, and she lays eggs along this gallery, and the larvae mine out as they develop. And you can see they've occupied quite a bit of the territory here. And that feeding cuts off the flow of sugar to the roots. And so when these trees die, it's a very rapid occurrence. They typically, bark beetle populations are low, they're attacking the weak trees because they're less well defended. But following disturbances like big windstorms or fires, you get enough dead undefended trees that they build up these huge outbreak populations. So typically when you see trees in groups like this that all turn red at the same time, bark beetles are often involved, even if what caused that mortality was, say, like a root disease, flooding, a low intensity fire or something that killed the roots, and then the bark beetles came in after, or if the bark beetles were the primary agent. Either way, the trees are going to be red like this because they died rapidly. So this could also be drought bringing this on. On the outside of the bark, so if you go to evaluate these trees, you look for the red boring dust or pitch streaming coming from multiple points. That indicates where the bark beetles have drilled through the bark, or tried to anyway, if they didn't get pitched out. In fir trees, this pitch is runny. In pines, like on the bottom right there, it globs up in these kind of popcorn-sized, we call them pitch tubes. And you can see the red powder there caught up in that white pitch or resin indicates that the beetles got into that phloem. And so the tree defense response may not have been super effective on that one. So pushing beetles out is their primary defense mechanism. If it's clear, the tree has probably been successful. And again, if it's red or brown, then the beetles were successful. And you can tell that if a tree has been occupied and used by these beetles. Look for these perfectly round exit holes that would indicate where new brood adults have emerged from that tree. So then this tree is really no longer useful to bark beetles anyway. It'll fill up with wood borers and other decay and decay fungi. So it's only useful for that one season. In addition, so to the bark beetles, the other big foes that we spend a lot of time on are root diseases. Some of the most important tree killing pathogens, especially when you look at Western Washington, where bark beetles aren't as big of an impact. So in fact, the bark beetles work together with root disease. They're commonly finishing off the trees that are declining from this. The root disease pockets sustain low numbers of bark beetles and don't lead to outbreaks because the root disease is adding just a few new dead trees to the system every year and don't support large population growth. So the fungi are spreading underground by root-to-root contact, illustrated in this this picture here has red colored roots that are all infected, and you get kind of this pattern of decline and dieback that has been going on for years. So if you walked into this stand, you'd notice a lot of snags that have broken off and fallen on the ground. It'd be kind of hard to walk through there. Trees that might have been uprooted with decayed root systems. Then you have trees like in the photo here that are still standing, but they're missing all their needles, and but the branches are still intact. And then you've got trees further out in the pocket that have missing needles. You can see more daylight through that crown, and that tree's suffering from the disease but hasn't died yet. And then you get out to the edge here, and you have a normal looking tree that may have an infection starting, but hasn't really been impacted yet. So these things are moving through this soil or through the roots very slowly, like less than a foot per year through this area. And then you get this big opening that allows a change in the forest structure. So young trees are allowed to, maybe shade tolerant or shade intolerant trees. Once that canopy's gone, they can really start growing. Maybe it's the same species that was infected. These root diseases have kind of like bark beetles. They can have more specific hosts they like. But if it's a different species that's not susceptible, you could get a kind of a stand replacing event here. But otherwise, these young trees that are coming in on the left here, they're kind of doomed. And so these are chronic, they're localized. We call them diseases of the site. If you clear cut a stand, you're not really getting rid of the root disease because it'll sit there and feed on the roots of those stumps and wait until new trees grow. So that can go on for many decades. All right. So root diseases are sometimes involved in young tree mortality too, like in that picture. On the left, there's some mortality and symptoms in a plantation where stumps, like I mentioned from the previous stand, have harbored the disease. And the young canopy, as it closes in, the trees are losing their competitive battle, and they start to succumb more to the disease due to their competition stress. We'll also see this in older stands, like on the right, where you have the smaller diameter shade intolerant trees. So Douglas fir in this example, if they don't get sunlight, those shorter trees are doomed. They just get overtopped by the bigger ones. And so the root diseases and the bark beetles do play an important role in kind of picking off these weak, suppressed trees. Once the stand thins out naturally or is thinned by chainsaws, they then move to a more vigorous dominant tree, and the disease level can sometimes subside in those stands. But there are sites where root diseases can be very, very aggressive, and they can just continue to kill even healthier, more vigorous trees if they're given enough time. Okay, so how do we tell friend from foe? And these are kind of the forest health concepts that we share with our landowners. Number one, is the damage impacting your management objectives, or will it in the future? And so think about, like, if you're growing Christmas trees versus your objective was an ecological preserve, something like a foliar disease wouldn't really impact those ecological objectives, but they would be a serious problem for something like Christmas trees. You need to understand that these are part of the ecosystem, which I've been talking about, and I've already mentioned that at low levels they're really beneficial. So a single tree dying in someone's yard or in a cemetery or a park or something, that's a big deal, but in the forest, really not a concern. It's not out of the ordinary to have single trees die. But when we have these big disturbances like drought, we've had a lot of recently, windstorms, fire, frost events, other factors like offsite planning, competition, human activity, construction. These all can create breeding material and reduce the tree vigor, its ability to produce that pitch or resin to defend itself. So that can tip the balance. And then we can have these higher levels of the pathogens and insects that can cause those structure changes I was talking about. This is the disease triangle. And you can think of disease as like the symptoms of any of these things that are attacking the trees, including insects. It's you have to have the pathogen or insect that matches the host. So Douglas fir beetle is not going to attack a western hemlock. So you got to have that match, and then you got to have the right environmental conditions. So that's either going to stress the host and make it more easy for the pathogen to kill it or damage it, or the environment somehow will benefit growth of the pathogen. So an example is the fire triangle that you might be familiar with. So if you're trying to put out a fire, you can eliminate any one of those three. You can put water on the fire to kill the heat. You can smother it with dirt to take the oxygen away. And so kind of similar concept with disease. If you eliminate or reduce one leg of this triangle, that can be kind of a beneficial management using the environment instead of going around trying to kill these things. So I'll use Swiss needle cast as an example for this. This is it's a native fungi. It gets its name Swiss needle because it was described in Switzerland when they started planting Douglas firs over there and brought this disease with them. Douglas fir is the only host, and it's these little kind of like spore producing structures. They're like very tiny mushrooms. They clog up the stomates or the breathing pores on the underside of needles. And this disease or this pathogen grows better when it's wet. And the main effect is you start losing these older needles because they can't photosynthesize and they start falling off. So it's a needle cast. And you can see here, new foliage, normal, previous year foliage, kind of brown and sickly looking. And then the 3-year-old stuff is completely gone. So it really impacts the tree growth. And this is some of our aerial survey of this disease damage, the yellow. Notice that it's confined mostly to the coastal areas where it's going to be wet, right? And so that's your environment factor. So if you wanted to manage this thing, you're on the coast, you can't do anything about that wet environment. You could encourage something like Sitka spruce or western hemlock, cedar, something that was not a host. The last one is that, like I said, it's nicer to have these forests set up so they kind of defend themselves, that they're made up of more vigorous trees that are resilient, they can defend themselves. And also, if they do get damaged, like this root down here that's been infected with root disease fungi, if they can wall that off, they're healthy enough to kind of flush the pathogen out of those roots, then they can grow new roots to get around losing those damaged ones. So they need a lot of resources for that. So our major forest disturbance agents that they impact the forest ecology, the species composition, the structure. They interact with one another. They have these ecological relationships that I've already kind of talked about. Even the diseases or insects themselves, you saw the sea of red with mountain pine beetle. Here's kind of the equivalent example. This is root disease. It looks like ringworm on the forest, essentially. And that root disease pocket is just expanding and slowly taking out that dominant stand and replacing it with something new. So that's a disturbance agent. But, a lot of these abiotic things, the weather and drought events, the fires, landslides and flooding, think of all those things that probably are contributing to more insect and disease issues as well. With bark beetles, when they go into this epidemic phase, so when I keep talking about outbreaks, that's what this is. It's kind of similar nomenclature with a virus. Endemic is those low levels. They're just kicking around in root disease, stress trees here and there. So your stand resistance is high when you have this endemic low level. But when you start seeing these factors come in, all these different disturbances, and also those older trees like with mountain pine beetle I was talking about, or too many hosts on the landscape, favorable temperatures for breeding and stressing these trees, you start to push the beetle numbers go up and the stand resistance goes down, and you kind of cross this threshold into the epidemic phase. This is a good illustration of, you guys have been talking about fire ecology. This is like Eastern Washington, Rocky Mountains area. These photos are from Western Montana. I don't know if you've seen something like this before, but it's a really cool photo series from one point over 80 years. The stand, even though they've been doing some logging in here, you can see some slash piles, that there were a lot of stands like this that were fire maintained frequent, low intensity fire came through, killed the younger trees, left the larger, more fire resistant ponderosa, bigger Douglas fir behind. Over time, fire's excluded, right? So those younger trees get to come up. There's been more logging where they're kind of high grading. They're taking those dominant trees off the landscape and opening up more sunlight to the understory. And so, long story short, you see this development over time where you get, first a lot of the ponderosa pine that were seeded there come in, and then it kind of starts to get taken over by fir at some point, and it's essentially unrecognizable to the old forest at this point. And what that brings on, unless a fire comes through there and just completely wipes out the whole stand, there's a lot of ladder fuels in here, right? So that can very easily move from what would have been kind of a brush fire, taking out young saplings, into the canopy. So change of structure, change in the species composition to more fir, tree density going up, tree vigor going down. And we see a lot of this over the landscape, and consequences as far as my area of specialty goes are this is a good list. More specific to Eastern Washington, we're seeing more extended western spruce budworm outbreaks, like in this picture here. This is a defoliating caterpillar that prefers fir trees, so the Douglas fir, grand fir that are coming up in that Montana stand. And this is Blewett Pass between Wenatchee and Ellensburg. Plenty of fir and what would normally be a more open grown, more pine dominated stand. And these budworms not only prefer that tighter growing fir and more host, but they also like the multiple canopy layers. So when the caterpillars are done feeding in the canopy, they then drop down and they still have more food. In a more open stand, they're going to fall on the ground and die or become bird food. You have more bark beetle outbreaks because, again, the competition in here is really high. So these trees have a hard time mounting their defense. The dwarf mistletoe, it's a parasitic plant. It creates seeds that are covered with this sticky goo. And when the temperature and humidity are right, those seeds come flying out explosively and they land on trees in the understory. And so again, multi-layer forests perpetuate this dwarf mistletoe. And root disease, high vigor tree can combat root disease better. And of course, the wildfire, right? We all know about that. So one thing that, to management that can be done about this, if you're able to do these kind of activities, and it can't be done everywhere, is forest restoration that essentially mimics that ecological role of what the, low intensity frequent wildfire would maintain in these stands. But just being done with equipment, and it's, like I said, it's not right for every stand. And some people look at a treatment like this, they're more used to seeing the kind of before photo here, and for them it's unnatural. That upper left photo is the natural state. So it takes a bit of adjusting and education. Okay, so bark beetles more specifically, I've already kind of mentioned a lot of this, so review here. Let's see what's new on this. Mass attack, I hadn't used that term before, but that's when the populations are really big and they use pheromones to coordinate attacking specific trees, and that allows them to overwhelm the defenses of that tree just with sheer numbers. And even a healthy tree kind of runs out of that pitch at some point. Another thing I didn't mention is that red color that we notice is probably bark beetles. That when you see that often means that those trees were killed the previous year. It just takes that long for the tree to dry out because the roots are still, even though they're not getting sugar anymore, they're still pulling water out of the soil. So like think of a Christmas tree in your living room, it's green, but it's very dead, right? So it's just getting water. And so these trees that are dead stay green, then the next season they dry out and turn red. So kind of chasing these red dead trees isn't a great management strategy if you're trying to get beetles off the site by cutting them, what we call a salvage or sanitation harvest. So sometimes in a really dry year, when we have droughts, that these trees might turn red that same season. So one thing to do is to look under the bark. And if you got beetles still active in there, then maybe you can do something about removing these trees. So general management, maintain that tree vigor, avoid injuring stems and roots, construction, that kind of thing. I get a lot of questions about pesticides being used to kill the beetles. Once they're in the tree, there really isn't a pesticide option because the damage is done at that point. So you use those to prevent attack. You're in an outbreak, you got a high value tree because this is really expensive. It's not something that's used in a forest setting, more like for ornamentals or campgrounds, that kind of thing. Specific to pine beetles, stand density isn't quite as important on the west side because you got a lot more moisture. But on the east side, and again, especially with pine beetles, the stand density is kind of your main weapon in preventing these bark beetle outbreaks. And, I don't know if you guys are covering basal area. I'm not going to get into detail on that, but you can see from the pictures, the difference in that square feet per acre of the basal area. The upper stand being about half the area stand density is going to be much more resilient if the bark beetles come in there than the lower stand at the higher level. So if you do some kind of thinning to reduce that stand density, it's important to select against the low vigor trees. So, those that aren't doing as well. In other words, like thinning from below and keeping the more dominant trees that are already, more vigorous and resistant. Oh, look, there's the pesticides again. I guess I should have deleted that off there. Just a little bit about Douglas fir beetle, because it's kind of unique from things like mountain pine beetle in that it builds up populations in storm damage or fire. So the cycle is you go low populations in those scattered dead trees or root disease. You get a storm, a couple years to build up the population in those down trees, and then you get this sort of stand level mortality coming a couple years, 3 years after the windstorm, and that outbreak could last 2 to 5 years. It tends to peter out when they start running out of weaker trees to attack, and they're forced to attack healthy trees, and a lot of them will die in the process of trying to get into a healthy tree. So they kind of eat themselves out of an outbreak. So one thing we do managing, again, mostly specific to Douglas fir beetle, is to manage that blowdown material. So in this picture, you've had a storm. If you've got 5 trees per acre that are of this size, they like, say 8-inch diameter, then anything below that, it's going to be lower risk because it just doesn't produce enough beetles. But in the bottom photo there, again, if that's not all hemlock or cedar or something, if it's all Douglas fir, you're almost guaranteed to have some kind of a problem. But the nice thing is their life cycle is a year from egg to adult. And so you have time. So we like to say you can salvage that material to get beetles out of there, or keep them from getting into it in the first place by removing it before the spring. And your last chance is that second spring after the storm. That's when they're going to fly out of this stuff. Okay, so root diseases more specifically. This is just showing what I was talking about, what's going on underground. This is armillaria, just one of the major root diseases. And these black root-like structures are called rhizomorphs. Sorry, you probably can't read that. And, you got your tree roots over here. They're rubbing up against rocks and things in the soil and growing. And, the root bark cracks and they leak sugar. And the fungus, it has to eat something. It doesn't make its own food. So it's looking for a free lunch, essentially. And so these rhizomorphs grow through the soil, seeking out those sugars and latch onto a root. They put these little hyphae or hair-like structures into the root, inject it with enzymes, digest the wood, and then suck the sugars out of there. And unfortunately, those enzymes in that process causes decay. And then the roots die back. You've seen this picture. And other symptoms that or may not be shown in that picture, you got thinning crowns. I already talked about a yellow color, because essentially these trees are they're not getting their nutrients because the roots are dying. So it's like your houseplants need fertilizer, right? They're turning yellow. Stress cone crop, again in this picture up here, trees are dying slowly. They can perceive that, obviously, so they want to reproduce themselves, and sometimes they'll put up these huge cone crops. And you get bark beetle mortality. Whenever I go out to look at bark beetle problems, I always look for root disease, because if you got root disease on a site, that's really the real problem, and the bark beetles are just responding. Picture I showed you before, another thing is reduced shoot growth from year to year. So between these branch whorls, that annual leader growth tends to get shorter. You got that yellow or chlorotic color I was talking about. And then to identify the root disease itself, you're going to want to look at decayed wood. So an uprooted tree is a good place to start. And if it doesn't have any fine roots anymore, it's just this wet, mushy, or really lightweight decayed wood. That wood itself can be used to identify these things. And mycelium, this is another fungus word, like the hyphae or the rhizomorphs. Mycelium is, just think of that, like white fuzz on your bread that's molding. This is a similar a similar thing that's on the root bark here, oftentimes white, either under the bark or on top of the root bark. So generally speaking, how do you manage these root diseases? They're challenging. Most important thing that's not on this list is get it identified, right? There are 3 major root diseases in our area, and you want to treat them all differently. They have different host ranges, and so knowledge is power, right? But generally maintain high tree vigor, like with the bark beetles. And then species manipulation, that's referring to, like in this picture in the bottom right, the last thing you want to do is, if you recognize you had root disease in a stand, you cut the stand to quote unquote start over, and you just plant the same species back there. You're just asking for it. So with some of these, there are resistant or totally immune tree species that you could plant. So changing that species composition. Where it says manage symptomatic trees to 2 tree widths or a buffer, essentially that's looking at this, root to root transmission underground. You just assume that the width of a tree crown at the base, that's at least as wide as its root system. And so, it's touching another tree next to it. And so you basically take like 50 feet out from that infected tree. You just assume everything's infected, whether it's showing symptoms or not. And you can put in a buffer by cutting out these trees. The fungi don't move really aggressively through stumps, so they kind of stop in there, and they're waiting for a new tree to come in as planted or seeded. And so you can stop these by creating, roads, buffers, a little clear cut buffer to keep them from moving through there. You can get really crazy with it and, remove the whole stump or do a push filling logging. Once those roots are exposed to the air, that's kind of Mother Nature's way of clearing some of this stuff out. You have a big windstorm, the fungus is exposed to the air, it doesn't grow anymore. And ignore this zoonosis one. I'm not going to get into details. I mentioned I wouldn't do that. The do nothing, that's actually a management option. People often forget this, that a decision to do nothing is a management action. And for root diseases, it may actually be a good one in some cases. If you've got a smaller area of the ownership, this isn't going to expand very quickly. You can embrace it as kind of a wildlife area where you're getting new and different structures that will support different birds and mammals and things that will use those openings versus the more closed canopy nearby. All right, so kind of rushing along here to finish up the bulk of this before 8:30. Hopefully not too fast. You guys are going to get these slides. So defoliating insects, this is the spruce budworm I was talking about, and I show these pictures just to help you keep in mind that these outbreaks, unless they kill the trees quickly, and there are just a few defoliators that do that, most of them are just feeding on like the new foliage, and so the tree retains the older needles, and it doesn't kill the tree, stresses it out, but then eventually the outbreak will collapse naturally. And again, this is the same tree. As long as it's got resources, it'll come back. Maybe you might get some top kill. And so just to illustrate the difference between the deciduous tree defoliators and the conifer tree defoliators, the deciduous trees are, they're used to refoliating every spring. They lose their leaves every year. So you got this really crazy example here of this tent caterpillar that hit these alders in July. And then they were so excited to refoliate, they did it that same fall, which doesn't make a lot of sense, but it's just their natural response. So they have the the resources to do that, and a lot of these have natural enemies like parasitic wasps that attack their cocoons and eggs, and they have diseases like viruses, and so those populations will kind of boom and bust, and when they collapse, trees recover. So you don't see a lot of long-term damage. They have ecological benefits. So one of the biggest ones is these caterpillars are pooping all of that chewed up foliage out and fertilizing the soil underneath this stand. They're reducing water demand in an area, which is good or bad, depending on what else is trying to grow there. These are, tent caterpillars. You're probably all familiar with these. Just as an example, they're only feeding on those deciduous or hardwood trees. The outbreaks are short-lived, like I mentioned, but they can have some pretty widespread impact. That photo is from our aerial survey of an alder stand that's, I don't know if you can see on your screen, but that's really all brown and it just looks dead. But those trees all came back the next year. So just some examples of different species here of those guys. This is the spruce budworm. Just to hit on this one a little bit more in detail, mentioned the Douglas fir true fir being the main component, and the severity of this is growth loss, stress. They're bringing in bark beetles coming after these trees. The new foliage, as you can see there, is what's getting chewed up. And when the natural enemies aren't usually enough to collapse this right away, like with some of the tent caterpillar types, and so they are chronic. And if you get more than 4 years of this new foliage getting chewed off, a tree naturally does not retain the old foliage for more than 5 years typically. And so if you're losing your new foliage every year, that after 5 years, you got nothing left. And so trees will actually start to die at that point. Young trees more heavily impacted because they have just less foliage to begin with. One way we manage this, it's one of the few defoliators that we manage for, is to monitor it. So we use pheromone traps that attract the male moths, and the counts, in this map, this is from quite a while ago when we had outbreaks going all over the east side. The warmer colors are indicating high trap catches, and that actually gives us an indication of what the defoliation impact will be the next year. And so that can give people information about if they wanted to do something about this. And what would you do? Sometimes spray projects are done for this. I mentioned pesticides not being great for bark beetles in the forest. For defoliators, you can take a helicopter or an airplane and distribute this on the foliage where these caterpillars are active, and you can actually treat a forest stand. And some of the more popular options are like a BT, which is a bacterial insecticide that only kills caterpillars of moths. And they use that to control gypsy moth, which you may be familiar with in Western Washington when we have gypsy moth introductions. But what we really try to encourage is, let's get away from the pesticide treatment and look at the silviculture, or how can we manipulate the stand so that it's kind of resistant on its own. And so these are the risk factors that we look at. Are the tree branches touching? So, are you seeing less than 20% of sky through the crowns when you're looking up? The trees are touching, it's easy for the caterpillars to get between them. How much Douglas fir or true fir posts do you have? If it's more than 30%, then it's easy for that to perpetuate. These little cartoon caterpillars dropping everywhere. They do this thing we call ballooning, where they hang on threads. You've all seen that, different kinds of caterpillars doing that. And so that allows them to reach these other trees. And then, so the more ponderosa you have, you get the cartoon hand barricading them from the pines. They don't feed on those And then I mentioned earlier these canopy layers, right? So if you have 2 or more layers in the canopy, that's another risk. And so you see how you could treat these things kind of like that picture I showed you earlier of the restoration to a fire managed landscape. You're not going to have as much problems with things like budworm because you have more of a single layer stand without that lower canopy layer. You're going to have less fur. All right, so foliar disease, I'm just going to breeze through this because I talked about Swiss needle cast earlier. Other names, needle blights or rusts. Trees can look dead, kind of like in this picture, but the impacts are more minimal because often that, as you can see, often that new foliage or the buds are undamaged. So when the conditions change, these are, like I said, they're kind of moisture dependent. And so we'll often see outbreaks of these things away from the coast when we have unusually wet seasons in spring or fall when the fungi are sporulating and growing. So local influence of weather, and going to skip the Swiss needle cast. Again, you've seen it, but that's kind of what this looks like. And that's why we can survey it from the air. You get this kind of browning of these Douglas fir stands in the black outline. You can manage, again, talked about this, growing non-hosts in those wet coastal areas where they grow naturally anyway. Manage those stressors like your competition because it's going to reduce tree growth. And then you can increase the airflow. So, the faster these moisture events, whether it's the daily humidity or the rain, the faster that moisture gets cleared out, the less likely it is for these things to be a problem. So, doing those thinning activities, the pre-commercial thinning in tighter stands can help. And then your impacts are worse on those exposed slopes. So like in this picture here, this is probably a south-facing side of the slope, or a ridge top tends to have more impact because, the needles are being desiccated or they can't photosynthesize. I'm sorry, not desiccated. They're not growing. And so that extra heat that you get on the south and the ridge just creates a droughty condition, and the needles will be cast more quickly. And here's your dwarf mistletoes I talked about earlier. So this is actually this kind of olive colored part. It's not a part of the tree. It's actually a little plant, and it's got its roots stuck down under the bark of the tree, and it causes this swelling here and an abnormal branching pattern. It creates these things called witch's brooms. And so this is kind of a severe example in Douglas fir. Doesn't kill trees right away, but you can see how that's not a good thing. Here's some witch's broom in western hemlock, one of the only mistletoes in western Washington. So they're in conifers. You've heard of the mistletoe, the kissing thing with Christmas. That's a hardwood. With the white berries, these are similar but different, just conifers. So they're diverting water and nutrients, stressing that tree, stunning growth. They reproduce with the explosive seeds I mentioned, so those can fly 30 to 50 feet away. The brooms provide, on the plus side, good habitat for animals. In fact, these western hemlock brooms are an important breeding site for the marbled murrelet, which is a coastal aquatic bird that actually requires these nesting platforms. So to manage these, again, Eastern Washington is the main area where you might be working on managing these. They respond to light. They're plants. And so in this picture here, you got one growing out of a ponderosa pine. It's just been clear cut, or not clear cut, but like a shelter wood cut. They open the stand up, lots of sunlight in there, and these little plants are really going to take off. So keep that in mind. Small scale, you can prune the brooms out, before they get to this stage. You could girdle the tree to kill it. That would kill the plants if you had to keep that as a wildlife tree, because they're obligate parasites. They need a living host. And, the most common thing would be to remove like an infected canopy before you're planting. And they're host specific. So if you had this monster, you could plant a bunch of pine or larch underneath this Doug fir, and it wouldn't get this mistletoe because it's specific just to Douglas fir, right? But if you did want Douglas fir planted in there, you'd want to put them, far away from this tree, probably 75 or 100 feet away, out of the range of those flying goo-covered seeds. This is the end of the presentation. Kind of bonus material at this point. It's 8:30, so you can go through these slides later. And I was just going to point out a few of the non-native issues that are impacting forests in Washington. So I will leave it there, just so there's time for question discussion.
Okay, great. Yeah, thanks, Glenn. Open it up to the class if they have some questions for Glenn.
I'm still here. You weren't listening to a recording, even though it may have sounded that way.
No, Glenn,
I was pretty lucid.
Okay.
Sorry. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. So I studied woolly adelgids in high school. That was my senior project. I grew up in Pennsylvania. Yeah.
Awesome.
2005. And I don't know, in some ways I felt like I was a little bit ahead of the curve, because nowadays it's like people are really paying attention to it. I mean, it's already wiped out. My daughter's saying hi. It's already wiped out a ton of, like most of the eastern hemlock out there. And when I went to Evergreen for my undergrad in 2011, I saw some woolly adelgids on a tree on the campus, and I told the manager people about it, and they thought I was crazy. They said that it only exists on the east. And I says, no, my research told me that it started out here and that there might be some populations still left, but it doesn't kill the hemlocks, at least not as fast, or I guess they can survive enough, but it doesn't. So can you just kind of elaborate more on that? Or
Yeah, sure. And I will start off by saying you are not crazy. Those are actually, those things you said are real. I don't know. Can you still see my screen? I'm going to share it again real quick. But that was one of the things I was going to talk about, was these adelgids. So this is the balsam woolly adelgid, which is on true firs like subalpine fir and grand fir out here. It's from Europe, and it makes these little white cotton balls on the stem. And inside there are these tiny little insects that look like this. They have these long straw-like mouth parts. They go down in the sap and suck the sap out of the trees and kill them by injecting toxic saliva. But here's your hemlock woolly adelgid, and yes, they are all over the Pacific Northwest. Usually, you only see them in like ornamental plantings or seed orchards. Parks, like the Evergreen campus is a good example where the hemlocks are just a little bit stressed, and so these adelgids can do better. But they don't. You're right; they don't kill western hemlocks. It's pretty rare, and that's part of that is a natural resistance of the western hemlock to these, and the other part is these predators that we've been collecting and they've been releasing back east. And the story is the difference between the east and the west. It's the same species, but the genetic analysis of the western hemlock adelgid shows that it came from Asia, probably Japan, but it came like 10,000, 12,000 years ago over the Bering Strait when it was a land bridge and the hemlock was growing there. And so it was able to move from Japan to where we are. And so it's been here for so long that the trees and the natural enemy population have adapted to control it, essentially. And that the introduction in the eastern North America, that happened really recently, like maybe 80, 100 years ago. And so those eastern hemlocks are just, they can't do anything. And the predators that are there, they don't know what to do with this thing, right? So, you are not crazy.
It's fine. It's good to hear that after 9 years, like of wondering, like, was I really crazy that? I had read that they're basically like a Japanese aphid, right? That's kind of my understanding, is the way they function.
Yeah, they're similar to aphids. They're sucking sap.
Okay.
They're specific to conifers.
Yes.
And they, once they settle in a place, they feed there for their whole life. You know, aphids will move around, but these adelgids stay put.
But isn't it true that they can turn it, like they try and reproduce and they get wings and they try and fly and find another species or something?
Mm-hmm. Yep. That's they have a couple generations per year. Okay. And like a good example is this spruce gall adelgid that you may have seen. It's one of its hosts is Douglas fir. And so it does this thing where it gets on the needles, makes these little white cotton balls, and then the winged adults that come out of one generation of these eggs will then fly to a spruce host. And all the adelgids reproduce on spruce trees exclusively. And so they fly there, they mate, and then they start a new generation. And on the spruce, they make these galls. They don't make white cotton balls. They feed inside near the buds, and this swells up, and the adelgids are in there. But these non-native ones, the hemlock adelgid and this balsam woolly adelgid, they don't have a winged form in North America. And because our spruces aren't suitable. And so they literally just reproduce by cloning. It's called parthenogenic reproduction. So the females just make new females. So the entire population is female. And they just keep going forever. And they're everywhere.
Thank you for all of that.
Yeah. Yeah, that's I never get those questions, so I could go on all day. Thank you.
Anybody else? Questions for Glenn?
I got one. Say your management plan involves girdling a bunch of trees. Is that possible then to kind of draw in beetles, which may spread on the neighbor's property who you might not want them to, basically, or would beetles already be there either way?
That's a good question, and that's actually something that's come up in a real situation a couple times. And so one thing to emphasize is everything I talked about, except for this stuff at the end here, is native. And so, Douglas fir beetle, mountain pine beetle, the root diseases, they're native and they're everywhere, like you're suggesting. So if your neighbor is saying, you brought beetles to your property and now they're on my property, that's not necessarily going to stand up in a court. You could be, though, producing more of these beetles through that kind of activity. And it would be a courtesy, to let the neighboring land manager know, hey, I'm going to do some kind of project. Like the couple of examples I'm thinking of, one was a ski run where they cut down all these trees and they didn't want to take the trees off the site for whatever reason. They weren't going to sell them as logs. And so they knew these trees were going to fill up with beetles, and they, wanted advice on what to do about that. Another one that's more along the lines of what you're asking was wildlife tree creation. It was part of a management objective. And one way to do that is to girdle trees. Like if you don't have enough natural dieback in the stand, you got to create these snags. And they went around and girdled Douglas fir trees, and they did quite a few per acre. And so they kind of broke that 5 tree per acre threshold I was talking about, and created a little bit of a Douglas fir beetle outbreak as a result of that girdling. So the important thing is, it's not like you can't do it. It's just to be aware, like these people were ahead of time. What can I do to reduce that or notify people? Maybe I girdle them a couple a year instead of all at once. But it is something real people have written into their management plan.
So I've got a question, Glenn. I'm assuming that, all of these insects, like you're mentioning, being native to Washington, are they fairly ubiquitous that you, given the right stand conditions, you'll expect them to be in nearly, any stand? I'm thinking at Evergreen, you've got a lot of, I don't know if you've spent much time walking through the woods out there, but, it's across the 1,000 acres. There's a lot of different stand conditions, from, very low stocked, open stands with large trees, large crowns, what I consider to be fairly healthy, good growth, vigorous, to extremely dense stands of Douglas fir in the competitive exclusion phase, a lot of stress on the trees, a lot of suppression mortality, et cetera. So you've got, all these different stand conditions. Would it be likely that we would find the presence of, any number of these insects out there on some level, not necessarily detrimental or catastrophic or what have you, but they're likely there at, to some extent?
Yeah. I think the theme would be, if you build it, they will come, and they don't come from very far away. So if you drop a big tree, that's fresh, it's got juicy inner bark for the bark beetles, I guarantee you it's going to fill up with bark beetles. Some species might get to it first and exclude the other. So we've seen where, depending on the timing of when this dead tree is created, the Douglas fir beetle, which is the one you might worry about, doesn't get to the tree because some other little, secondary bark beetles got there first, or wood borers even, and they occupied the territory. And so they're, generally speaking, they're everywhere. In cases where we see trees that die and don't get beetles are usually when, like with drought is a good example recently, where there were so many new trees coming online dead, or they were so dry when they died that the beetles weren't using them. And so you would find these dead trees and chop in there, sampling for beetles, and there would be nothing in there, which is kind of unusual. But if, again, there's only so many, if you're not having a beetle outbreak, then if you create 100 dead trees in a stand all at once, that there's no way the beetles can get to all of them.
Okay.
But yeah, if you want to collect bark beetles, just drop a tree for sure. You don't even need a bait or anything.
Yeah, Thomas.
So that actually brings up a question for me related to that. So could you inoculate mushrooms into those trees that you're like cutting down or cutting back or whatever? Or could you maybe introduce a less detrimental beetle, like you were just saying, like a bark beetle or something that's not gonna essentially wipe out, a bunch of things? Like, is that a strategy that DNR uses, or is that maybe that's too intimate of a way of dealing with things. Like maybe might make more sense for a student,
I mean, introducing the other bark beetle sort of like as a competitor that's not as big of a deal. There's nobody doing anything like that. Because it would be pretty challenging, and the more aggressive beetles would probably beat you to it anyway. The inoculation, though, again, as a wildlife tree creation, there are heart rots. I didn't talk about those, but they're kind of like the root disease, but they attack the dead heartwood of standing trees, and they create this hollow column of decay inside the tree, which is great for wildlife. And so there are cases where people have inoculated those through a wound, artificial wound. But this might be kind of off your question. But there are some cases where we use pheromones that are created by the beetles themselves to manipulate their behavior. And again, I don't have time in the slides, but I mentioned the pheromone they use to attract other beetles to kill, mass attack a tree, right? Well, once that tree is full, there's no use for the beetles to continue attracting new, because they're just going to compete with each other, right? So when that tree is full and the mating has occurred and the egg laying has started, they actually produce this anti-attractant pheromone, which is like a repellent essentially. And so these newly arriving beetles coming to that, mass attack tree, they detect this repellent pheromone, and it's like a no vacancy sign at a hotel. They're like, oh, this tree is full, so I'm going to go to the next tree. And that's actually the reason why you get these pockets I showed where you get 10, 20 dead trees all in one spot, is because that initial mass attack, and then you get that spillover from the repellent pheromone. And so it only really works. So it's been synthesized, and you can buy it for Douglas fir beetle and for mountain pine beetle. They sell these pheromones, and you can put them out on the landscape in these little plastic pouches or drop flakes from a helicopter. And so if you treat a whole little stand, 30, 40 acres, the beetles come in there and they are confused. They think all these trees are full, and they just keep flying, and then they leave the stand and go attack the neighbor's trees, right? So hopefully you talk to them about it. But yeah, that's the thing. That's the thing we use, the repellent pheromones. And we use the attractant ones to trap them for monitoring.
Yeah, I've seen those little like boxes hanging in trees, like those little yellow things, and it says "do not touch" or whatever. This is,
Yep.
Collecting data. That's a really good point. And so, is there like a market for those pheromones? Like, I mean, thank you for explaining that, but it seems like a very a niche market, But I'm just
wondering.
It
is pretty niche. I mean, there's a couple companies that make the stuff, and you can buy it in lots of different places. But there's some new ones coming online for research that some of these other beetle species were worried about. We're hoping to get repellent pheromones for them. And so there's encouraging products, but the cost to get the EPA, because these are treated as pesticides, even though they're not killing anything, they're still considered pesticides. And so you got to get the EPA label. And for these companies to do that, all that testing that's required, it doesn't pay off, because they're literally selling like very small amounts of this stuff every year. Yeah.
So it sounds like there's really some work that needs to be done with like getting some policy in place or getting some things changed on that, so that Kurt can buy some for his forest in his backyard or something if he wanted to, rather than just being a DNR thing.
Yeah, well, no, the Doug fir beetle one, it's called MC. I mean, anybody can buy this stuff. I recommend it to private landowners all the time. It's super effective and it's cheap. And so that, even with having that number, it's still a niche market, but it's not an insignificant number of people. So like if you guys had a big windstorm and there was a bunch of downed trees at Evergreen, that would be a perfectly reasonable thing to do. And you don't have to do it very long, just a couple of years.
But else have anything for Glenn? You know, we've made some observations out at the evergreen forest. Obviously, the laminated root rot's pretty ubiquitous out there, widespread.
I have a question about spruce. I don't know what the right pathogen is, but it attacks Sitka spruce leaders.
The leaders?
And, that's different than the other spruce problem you talked about?
Yes, yeah, different than the spruce budworm, and different than the Cooley spruce gall adelgid. I don't know if I can't remember if I talked about anything else in spruce, but yeah, it's called the white pine weevil. It used to be called the Sitka spruce weevil, or spruce weevil. And they changed the name because they realized that the eastern species was the same as the one out here, and it attacks white pine in the east. And it's weevil, right? The big nose, you're all familiar with that. They like the fast growing leaders of spruce trees, and they'll lay eggs in there, and their larvae will mine inside that leader and killing the pith inside there, and then the leader turns brown and it curls over and dies, and then you get the side branches take over as a new leader, and then it just gets nailed again the next year, and you end up with these spruce trees that, once you know what this thing looks like, you can see it everywhere, and they look like bushes. They're not these nice straight growing conifers anymore. And one way that's managed is making sure the spruce don't grow very fast. So when you get out on the coast where it's foggy all the time, you don't see much problem with this weevil. And that's where Sitka spruce likes growing anyway. So it's just a natural control, essentially. And then the further you get from the coast, there's natural Sitka spruce further inland, but people plant it too. You see way more problems with this weevil because the leaders are growing like crazy. Another thing that people talk about, I don't see many people doing this, but if you really, really wanted to grow spruce in Western Washington, you could plant something taller next to it, like alder, or even just tightly planted spruce, so they're growing slower, and that reduces the problems. But eventually they grow out of it. About 30, 40 years, a tree gets big enough that they don't like the leader anyway. And then you end up with these beautiful, ship mast, perfect spruce we see. They grew up with the weevil too.
So I just did a pre-commercial thin, and the planters put some spruce out in pretty open areas. And so Matt Provenchar was out looking at my place a couple weeks ago, and I think he's the one who recommended maybe underplanting it. And so I just dug up about a dozen of those little trees and put them in a swampy area where they were the smallest thing in the forest instead of the biggest. And is that something that makes sense? It seems like from what you just said.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it does, because you're growing them in a little bit of shade. They're not going to tolerate total shade, I don't think, but you're going to slow them down, and so the weeviling should theoretically be better. The other thing that people, if you're trying to get them to grow fast, the weevil's a pest. If you don't really care how fast they grow, then you can just wait it out, right? They don't kill the trees. They just turn them into bushes. But what you're doing is a good strategy.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the other thing that I think, totally different situation, but Western red cedar is, you mentioned laminated root rot, and of course I didn't go into detail on that, but laminated root rot, you have those choices, right? You can plant Western red cedar is resistant, the white pine is resistant, the hardwoods are resistant. So laminated, you got options, right? So a lot of people will be planting Western red cedar in their root disease areas, but then the deer come and just destroy these Western red cedar when they're young. And so another thing I've seen people doing, and I don't know how official this recommendation is, but they'll take a Sitka spruce seedling and a cedar and plant them together, like literally in the same hole. And the deer don't really like that spiky spruce as much right there. And then as they're growing up, of course, you have less problems with the weeviling because you're creating competition, slowing the spruce down. So maybe a win-win there. Other thing I've seen people do is planting the cedar in like piles on the ground. The deer don't like, they're kind of lazy. They don't want to walk through the pile.
Or you
I've
could
got a
put
question that I'm
on.
embarrassed about, having been a forester for 20 plus years. And I have to admit this ignorance in front of my entire class. I'm teaching forestry, but so you've got laminated root rot that spreads by root grafting. If it's spreading by root grafting, how does it get established in a new area?
Yeah, that's a good question. It
Is
actually
it spontaneously created, like immaculate conception, or
yeah.
what's
It's kind of like the what was that, the germ theory or whatever, when somebody finally decided to put a glass bowl over some bread, and they're like, oh, the mold isn't growing on the bread because I put this glass bowl over it. It's the spores, right? They're everywhere.
But Phalaenus, I didn't think Phalaenus produced spores. There's no fruiting body to it.
Right, there is, but it's almost impossible to find it. And it rarely makes this fruiting body. So like the armillaria I showed, the cartoon had the little mushroom above. That's the only root disease that makes mushrooms. So that one's kind of obvious. And the anosis that I skipped over will make these little conchs. So they're kind of like hard, like the shelf fungus you've all seen coming out of decaying wood. Those are a little bit more obvious, and they make spores. But the laminated makes this kind of crusty, I don't have a picture of it, but it just looks like almost like a dried up slime mold or something. And it's just growing on the surface, kind of like a brown tan color, and it makes spores. But I've been doing this for 12 years, and I see laminated root rot like, I don't know, 10 times a year. I'm digging around somewhere and find it. And I've only seen this fruiting body once. So they're rare. But yeah, that's how it happens.
Cool. All right. Answered a lifelong question there.
Yeah.
This is definitely worth the price of admission.
Yeah. And if you go online, there's a couple publications about laminated root rot, and I'm sure there's a picture of that thing somewhere. But it just looks like a brown mold. Not very remarkable.
Okay. Well, we got a few more minutes. Does anybody else have a question for Glenn?
I have a question. When you were talking about the Swiss needle casting, you talked about thinning out the canopy so that more air could come in. Something we're learning in class is that like the forest works in a continuum. So could there be any downfalls to like thinning out the canopy and creating a drier environment in it?
Yeah. I mean, I mentioned the drought conditions, and of course, like if you're thinning, you're probably not going to be pruning these trees, right? You would just be spacing them out more. And people in a managed stand, a planted stand, will do that anyway as like a pre-commercial thin as part of their long-term plan for that stand. You plant way more trees than you're going to end up with eventually. And so you plant heavy and you plan to thin. But you're right. There can be downsides to that, and one of them is intuitively thinning is good for drought, right? Because each tree has more water source, but you're also adding more sunlight into that. And these little trees, they've grown up close to their neighbors, and they're used to that cooler environment. It's not so much about water availability that I'm talking about. It's about the sun literally just toasting these needles or sun scald. Sometimes you get like a burning, like a sunburn almost on the bark when these stands are opened up like that. And sometimes that can cause a canker fungus to get going in there. It's not gonna annihilate the whole stand, but you can get some impacts from that. And these drought damage issues that we've been having recently, I think they're more related to what we call a hot drought. So it's not just the lack of water that's the definition of a drought. It's also the heat, right? And we get these days that are like 90 degrees plus. In the summer, a record number of these days, our trees in Western Washington are not used to that. And they're losing a lot of water out of their needles. And so again, a young stand that's just opened up, you could have more of an impact of that in an unusually hot year. That's the main thing. Downside, I mean, since I'm not a forester or ecologist, maybe there's others I'm not thinking of.
Okay, thanks, Glenn. Well, we're up against 9 o'clock, so I think we'll end it there. But appreciate you joining us and sharing your wisdom and experience. And I know that being a loyal public servant, that if folks have questions, they can look you up and check back in with you if need be. So.
Yep, absolutely. I mean,
all right.
Response isn't always fast, but it will get responded to.
All right.
Yeah. All right. Well, good luck with the class, guys.
Yep. Thanks, Glenn. Really appreciate it.
Yep. Have a good night.
All right.